This PowerPoint will examine the 1950s to the 1970s, looking at the different presidents and movements that occurred through domestic policies and foreign policies through Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, the Civil Rights Movement, Women's Movement, and the Latino and Native American Movement. Some of the material you would have heard before, so please pay close attention as we go through this session. Harry S. Truman was known for establishing the Truman Doctrine, which aided countries who resisted communism. This occurred first in Europe and then later the Middle East, which was taken over by Eisenhower with the Suez Canal crisis. He also recognized Israel as a country in the 1940s when they actually were created as a homeland and had a state. Eisenhower, the former commander-in-general for the Allied powers in Europe, became president. The common slogan for him was "I like Ike." He was basically a middle-of-the-road Republican who followed some of the doctrines and policies of Truman but added his own. He's also known for highway construction, the interstate, primarily for making sure that we had access to military tanks and supplies quickly because of the Cold War. He recognized Israel, but Israel was not recognized by countries in the Middle East, which created crisis. Wars were happening with Israel several times, and each time the U.S. sent in troops or sent airplanes or supplies to support Israel. We've talked about the Suez Crisis before, which is the fight of the Suez Canal between Israel and Egypt. America backed Egypt in this fight and got Israel and France to back down when they were attacking Egypt because he wanted access again to the Aswan Dam. Eisenhower Doctrine was used to provide military and economic aid to Middle Eastern countries to fight communism because Russia and America were trying to win the hearts of those third world countries, and they had resources that we needed. JFK, the new boy and the new frontier. He introduced civil rights legislation, but he's not the one who passed them because he actually was assassinated before any of his laws could be seen into action. But Johnson, his vice president, took the helm and did many of the legislation and the goals that he wanted to, along with his brother Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General. The key things in New Frontier was JFK's pledge to land on the moon. If you recall, back in the late 40s, early 50s, we were in the Cold War, and Russia launched a satellite called Sputnik, and that gave panic, which is why you had administrators and presidents trying to make sure that education pushed for science and technology in the classrooms. Well, Kennedy took it a step further and believed that we could have someone land and eventually walk on the moon. Again, notice the trend. JFK pledged to do it, but he never saw it happen. It was actually Nixon who was able to see the implementation of NASA. Today, NASA is still in occurrence, but it doesn't have the same goals. Kennedy also started the Peace Corps to help third world countries. He wanted to give education to those countries. Democracy could be spread that way. Similar to what you would think about when we think about Wilson's moral diplomacy. The key thing with Kennedy administration is the Cuban Missile Crisis that we talked about. Of course, that's when we placed missiles in Turkey, and Russia had missiles in Cuba. For about 15 days that we were deciding whether or not we would have nuclear war. Neither side blinked, but we had a stalemate. Of course, the Bay of Pigs was a failure, and that made his administration look weak. Kennedy increased the involvement in Vietnam, as we discussed earlier, but he was not fully committed. The main thing that he did was send in troops, some soldiers as far as advisors to the South Vietnamese government. He also gave money for education in hospitals, but of course the Vietnamese leader in the South was very corrupt. He abused the funds and did not use it to help the people, which made the people hate him more, which only strengthened the resolve of the Viet Minh who actually wanted to become communists. He had a hard time getting things passed because of Southern Democrats. Even though Kennedy was a Democrat, he was from the North, he was a Catholic, he was not a Protestant. In the South, of course, there were white Southern men, and some of the legislation he wanted to pass was, of course, civil rights, and so he had some blockage there, and so that hurt him. They saw he was too young, which is why he needed LBJ to be his vice president in order to get elected, because he was from Texas and a Southern Democrat. Once Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson took over, and he pushed Kennedy's Civil Rights Act of 1964 into place. The Civil Rights Act allowed African Americans to not be discriminated in the workplace. The Voting Rights Act is actually what allowed African Americans to go register to vote and got rid of some of the discrimination, like literacy tests and the poll taxes that were used. Eventually, we did pass an actual amendment that outlawed poll taxes. But the grandfather clause and all those Jim Crow laws that were used to block blacks from voting was done away with through the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that's where we get our Freedom Riders. The Fair Housing Act of 68 makes sure that discrimination was not being used in practice for housing. Oftentimes, when we think about civil rights legislation, or we think about Jim Crow or racism, we think about the South. But in the North, you also had it. They had de facto segregation, which means that although there wasn't laws to say you couldn't sit here or stand there, there was a coded understanding that you lived in certain places, with the Fair Housing Act to make sure that they could not keep you from getting a home or moving to an apartment based upon your race or ethnicity. Johnson was also known for affirmative action, which is very controversial today. But at that time, affirmative action was trying to right some of the wrongs from the historical discrimination that was done through, of course, slavery and the Jim Crow era. We want to make sure that a certain percentage of minorities were allowed to receive jobs and be in workplaces and schools, which opened the door for students and women. So when we think about affirmative action, we always think about African Americans, but affirmative action also helps other minorities, Latinos, women, Native Americans, and so forth. Medicare and Medicaid, we still have today, were plans to help those who are impoverished, because basically in his Great Society, Johnson created a war on poverty, and that war on poverty included the Head Start program. Some of you may actually have been a part of that program. Education started at an early age is very beneficial, so he wanted to make sure that those students and those families who were in an impoverished situation could actually get preschool education provided for them through Head Start programs. Today, public schools have Head Start programs. If you have a disability, or you are behind in testing, or you have a financial need, you can start kindergarten at K4. Let's examine this political cartoon. Take a moment. Let's see what it says. You have a white student that says, "Hugh, though SAT questions were brutal, what do you think?" The African American student says, "I got the one where I check off my ethnicity, so I know I aced it." This is by Jim Huber. And then at the bottom you can see Supreme Court studies. The University of I do believe that was California. There was a court case that was actually challenging affirmative action. But the court ruled that there was inherent discrimination in schools, and they need to open the door to allow ethnicities to be accounted for, and not just base interest into schools based upon exams. But if you look here, the perception was that if you were black, you got in, and you did not need to have any type of intellectual ability to do it. Many people feel there are biases in SAT questions, cultural biases, because students who are in a different socioeconomic status wouldn't necessarily use a cup and saucer. So those questions are still around today. Today, affirmative action, as far as colleges, are going a different way. We still have other ways and means that we look at students when they're entering besides a standardized test score like SAT and ACT. But there's been a backlash because we feel like today some of the issues of racism have been erased, and now we have reverse racism occurring. Students are not allowed to get into schools because they're holding spots for students. And that's been the main issue in recent news. Continuing LBJ. He was also known for being a great supporter of the arts. He created the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities. He also was known for social welfare programs. Today we think about SNAP, EBT. Those things were started to make sure that we provided a means for helping those who were impoverished. But basically because a lot of our men were off during the draft fighting in the war during the Vietnam era, and so you had a lot of women who were home and did not have a male in the home, and so for this was a way to help women raise their kids and not be in poverty. It was a good attempt, but it created some controversial things because it became a way of life for some people, as some would argue. He was not successful in foreign affairs, as you know. People blamed Vietnam on LBJ, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. He lost credibility with the people, along with the scandal with the My Lai massacre. So instead of running for office for another term, he actually stepped down, and that's when Nixon came into office. Now, if we recall, Nixon actually ran against JFK back in 1960, but lost because of the debate that they had on TV, the first televised presidential debate. And Nixon came across as being old. He lost very narrowly. He was Vice President Eisenhower. And when Nixon comes to the forefront in 68, people are tired of Vietnam. He promises to get them out of the war. He practices Vietnamization, but he also was the first Republican to actually get votes from African Americans because he pushed through many of the programs that LBJ had started, and he enforced civil rights issues. So LBJ passed legislation, but Nixon is known for the ones who actually enforced those laws that were created. So he gained credibility in the African American community. He also was a big supporter of the environment, just like another Republican. Can you tell me who? I'm pretending that you can actually respond to me, but of course that's going to be Teddy Roosevelt. He started the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. He also protects endangered species. And we have those in place today to make sure we do celebrate Earth Day, and that's coming up next month. I do believe it's held in April. And here we go, Polar Bear saying, save me. We want to save our animals and save our land and save our resources for future generations. We talked about Vietnamization when we talked about Vietnam. He also expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia. Again, the domino theory is still in place there, and he thought if he bombed Laos and Cambodia, that would stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it didn't work. And so therefore, he sort of started to withdraw the troops, gave more control to the Vietnamese, teaching them how to fight for themselves, slowly trying to find a plan for us to come out of the war. And in the meantime, if you look at this picture, you see a picture of the American flag, you see the Chinese flag, because he wants to build what the word is, rapprochement with China. He wants to make sure that the Soviet Union and China don't buddy up, because the Cold War is there, and if they are in a situation where they are allies, that could be detrimental to America. He also tries to slow down the Cold War by using détente. He wants to ease the tensions, so he recognizes China as a country. They're back on the UN Council. He wants to ease things. If he eases things, he also makes it easier for us getting oil, because there were oil embargoes placed on America in the Middle East because of the Cold War and some of the tensions that we had with the Soviet Union. Again, Nixon supported Israel, just as all U.S. presidents have done. Nixon was able to have a good relationship with OPEC. OPEC stands for oil producing, exporting countries. We need oil. And so because he was able to stop the oil embargo, the price for gas went down, which made many Americans happy. People truly liked Nixon. But what happened with Nixon, and the reason why he was forced to resign, was the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal will open the door for Jimmy Carter to run for office. What basically takes place is that we have members of the Republican Party breaking into the Democratic headquarters that was at the Watergate Hotel. Nixon was not party to it, but he found out about it and he tried to cover it up. There were tapes that had evidence that he knew that it was a crime that